Hi guys, welcome to episode 9 of Capricia. The second part, well, a belated second part of the rail yard episodes, and it's taken me a long time to get this episode out, which is really just down to one huge event which has overtaken everything. I don't need to go into detail, but I do want to just say that I give my best wishes to everybody out there. Hope you're all staying well and washing your hands, and I hope all your friends and family are staying well. It's a pretty horrible situation, but I'm sure we can all get through it. It's just going to take a long time. The plus side is it gives us a bit more time to work on cities, doesn't it? But yeah, it's not something that I'm glad to be. I don't want to be in this situation, but there we go. We're going to make the best of it. So yeah, my best wishes to everybody out there. But from now on, I want this episode to be a coronavirus-free zone. I'm not going to be talking about it anymore. But I do think, it's a bit of an elephant in the room. It needs to be mentioned. Yeah, there we go. So, moving on, this little introduction. We are going to be getting back into the build, and the rail yard is going to be finished in this episode. That's the plan. Getting into the build now. Started off doing is putting down some of these signalling equipment and points on the railway itself, and all these little electric boxes, all the kind of railway details that you get. Which I think is quite important to do. I mean, a lot of these sort of details you're not really going to see, but it does add to the general kind of feel for the entire build. So I think it's important to get these things in. And then once they're in, I could concentrate on working out the kind of infrastructure elements of the rail yard itself. So the road that you can see that I'm building here with the bridge is the main access road that runs north-south and divides the rail yard into two. And the way it kind of works is, I thought probably over the period of the history of the rail yard, maybe it's been extended, and the area on the west side is more kind of brown coloured, more earth coloured, and maybe that was the original rail yard. The area on the other side of the bridge on the east side is more kind of concrete textured ground, and that one might be more sort of contemporary, sort of maybe the rail yard's been extended in the recent years. So I thought logically that there was some kind of like history here, and the rail yard has undergone different kind of phases, I guess, over the years. And this bridge here might be one of those, or a more recent bridge. So maybe this was built when the rail yard was extended, and allows a kind of main kind of access route into the entire complex. And off this road you then have the different areas. You have the kind of freight area, the container area, the train sheds themselves. So this road does act as a main kind of like a main connection through the entire complex. So it's a very important road connection, this one. And what I've done a lot of in this build particularly is convert a lot of these objects and things using PO, which gives me a lot more flexibility. You notice on that bridge that I was doing, I PO'd the columns there, just because it gives you a lot more flexibility. I can sort of move them where I want. I'm not sort of dictated by the game. And also I reduced the scale of them slightly. I made them a little skinnier because I think it looks a bit more realistic. Things like that just help, as I say, to add to the sort of realism of it. So I was going very, very PO heavy on this build. I would say probably maybe 75% of the build is PO'd, which is quite a lot considering. Even these train sheds I think were PO'd, and the reason for that is not because I'm editing the scale of these, but I am fine-tuning the positioning of them, and I find that I can do that much easier when they're converted PO than when they're just a normal kind of asset. because the positioning of them I can be a lot more precise with, and in fact I do that with the train carriages, the wagons as well. In the latter part of the video you'll see I convert those as well, because it just gives me a greater control once they're converted in PO, a greater control for the positioning of them. So with this build here, this is, as I say, this is more of a kind of contemporary part of the rail yard. Maybe this was a recent kind of extension to the complex. And I saw these on the workshop, these little kind of copper roofed train sheds, and I thought they'd be quite cool to put into the city, because I've got so many generic sort of warehouse shed structures everywhere, and I wanted to just make something a little bit different, you know, something a bit more unique, and I think they sort of fit in there quite nicely. One of the big problems with a rail yard in particular is such a big area. I mean, this is a vast area, and it's especially when you kind of zoom out and you think, oh, I've got so much to fill, and the decals on the ground can only do so much of the heavy lifting. You do have to add details in as well, and things like kind of little kind of freight areas and buildings and so forth, which is fine. But one of the things I found was adding in fences and walls helps to break up the monotony of the ground a lot, and also divides your area into smaller areas, which is then easier to then focus on rather than one big area. So what I tend to do is, once I put the ground in, as you can see here with the concrete, I then divide that up. I'll often then put down some fences and things, and that will help to almost align a kind of border to what you're working on. You can move it if you want to, but it just helps to give you a little bit of focus more, because otherwise you just end up with these big areas and it's very hard to work out how to almost fill them. The other thing is to look on, obviously, Google Maps as well. That is an endless supply of inspiration, particularly for something like this build, because it's so big. And again, you'll notice that even the big areas are often divided into smaller areas, and then that will help you focus, because otherwise you can easily get, I guess, you can lose inspiration, let's say, because they're so big, these areas. And this rail yard was a colossal build, certainly the biggest build I've undertaken so far, and probably one of the biggest builds in the city, I would imagine. I mean, the container port might be a bit bigger possibly, but certainly this is one of the biggest builds I think I'm going to undertake. So finishing off the little train sheds here, adding in some details and things. These are little electric boxes. I think these might be Japanese electric boxes. Doesn't really matter, just because a lot of this stuff is pretty generic. You can use it wherever you fancy. So I kind of use those here just to add here. So just putting in another train shed. You can't have too many train sheds in a rail yard. This is an older style building. And I decided to make a kind of one of the doorways there open so that I can put a train inside. And again, if you can convert that to PO, you can then easily do that. Sometimes it's a bit of a knack to get it to work properly, and sometimes the textures distort and stuff, but there's ways of getting around that. You can often put a little kind of wall inside or something just to reduce that distortion effect. This one I didn't bother because I thought it looked fine as it was. Yeah, I mean, it's quite nice to do something like that if you can use PO just to break up the repetition of that building by making one of the doorways there. And then obviously putting more tracks in. I mean, this is the thing, when you put these sort of train sheds down, you then have to add even more tracks onto the build, as if I didn't have enough already. And you can see I do tend to struggle a little bit with these tracks. I mean, after a while you get to know how they work, but initially is a quite not complicated, but just a bit tricky to get them to do what you want them to do. By moving them around and changing the angles, you can then get them to work, but they can be a little bit tricksy when you first start using these railway lines, I find. And once we've got this in, you'll see me build another train shed, which again is a bit different also. It's quite important, I think, to get the bigger sort of buildings in and then work out the smaller details around them, which goes without saying really, but this is the last, I think this is the last of the train sheds now going in, which is a bigger area actually. I've ended up with about a dozen or so train sheds here, and again I use PO just to edit these, and obviously once you've got these in I had to add even more lines in, so yeah, it's a very, very long build, this one, and I did underestimate just how long it was going to take me to get this one finished, and I suppose probably ended up with a good maybe 10 hours of video all in, which I had to edit down considerably, which is fine, but sometimes I wonder what to show and what not to show. I mean, I decided to show a lot of these kind of like PO edited areas just because I think they might be a bit more interesting, because you don't want to be looking at me putting fences down for 20 minutes. I don't think that's particularly interesting, but hopefully the video is a bit more interesting than maybe it would be if I hadn't thought so carefully about what I was going to show, because it's not as if I didn't have enough content, it was just wondering what to sort of show for 20 minutes. So yeah, there we go. I mean, this last kind of build here that I'm putting in, this last kind of train shed, I've discovered that I had one extra doorway there, which I decided to just edit to get rid of, and again just putting these railway connections in, and then after this I actually start to put some of the wagons down, and that's really when the train rail yard started to come to life, started to spring to life, because you can find get a little bit demotivated, I think, sometimes when you're doing these big builds. You think it's not really working or it's not looking very realistic. The best thing to do is to keep going with it, because often you get to a point where it suddenly just jumps into life, and I think that's probably what happened when I started to add the wagons and the trains in. It started to sort of just become a lot more kind of like looked a lot more realistic, a lot more finished. But at this point I'm still adding in various kind of details, things like car parks and areas that, you know, sort of industrial areas around the main rail yard itself. Trying to pad it out a little bit, and also adding some trees and foliage that helps just to make everything pop a little bit more. Not really trees as such, but more sort of bushes and grasses, scrubland, that sort of thing, because the rail yard is an industrial area, you know, it's not going to be lots of trees, it's pretty open. But yeah, that sort of helps with the realism, I find, once you start adding on the sort of foliage and things like that. Finally we're getting to the wagons themselves. So with these, I converted them into PO first of all, again just because the placement I can be more kind of accurate and precise with. I'm trying to get it sort of aligned as best I can on the railways, which is not too easy. It takes a bit of practice, and probably placed quite a few hundred of these wagons on at the end of the build. I was quite used to how it works, but yeah, it took a bit of practice at the beginning, trying to get them aligned on the tracks there. But the other thing, I wanted to get quite a few different types of wagons on, so you can see me just adding all these different trailers and things in. Again, converting them to PO objects so I can copy them and move them easily. I find that by adding an assortment of different wagons, that also helps with the realism. You end up with a lot more kind of like contrast, because rail yards often do have different types of wagons and things there. The tankers and obviously the containers and things. But yeah, it's just filling up these lines really to give it a sense of as if it's a real living, breathing city. And even though these are just props, they're not functioning, not functioning trains, it still helps to give it a sense of realism, because often rail yards do have a lot of these parked trailers everywhere. And then you have the odd sort of train going through, which is what I want to get. Hopefully I'm going to get a few sort of trains running through this area, which I think will really help to give it that extra realism. Now, another thing I had an idea, actually I didn't have the idea, it was actually a fellow YouTuber, The Phoenician. He suggested using the kind of track and rail prop. These are just the sort of the sleepers, I guess you call them, and the railway lines themselves, just the actual tracks. Just these props, again converted into PO obviously, and then planted in here, just plonked on the ground, because I wanted to make it look as if this was a new kind of railway line that's being built here. So I just put that in there. It's an extra little detail really. So thank you, The Phoenician. That was a good suggestion. And I might be doing a bit more of that in the future, some sort of construction project parts of the city, which I think was quite interesting thing to do. So now I'm putting the trains in. You can see these little trains here, little engines, and also these kind of catwalk areas, these areas, access areas that you can, the workers can get to the cabin of the train, get in, service the train, and so forth. So again, just adding these in, which I think helps to give it just a little bit more realism. You know, I mean, these are just a timber deck, I think, for piers and things like that for boats, but I just changed the colour, and it gives it sort of a feel like they're kind of a little catwalk there on the next to the railway line, and a few more sort of trailers and things. But generally, these are going to just be the areas for where the trains live themselves. So again, I've got all these different train models that I can plant into position, and yeah, I mean, I didn't really edit them, to be honest. I mean, the colours look really good as they are, so I just sort of used these models and just planted them in. But I do love these sort of trains. I mean, who doesn't love a train? Yeah, I think they look really cool in the city. They have these little sort of little locomotives. We're getting closer to the end of the build now. Too far off the end. I do suggest, because it's quite hard to get a sense of the scale of this build. I keep saying this, but the train yard was huge, and it's taken a long time to do. So I really would recommend just staying around for the last couple of minutes, because there's a long section on the cinematics which does show the enormity of what I was building here, which is a bit nuts actually when you look back, because you think, God, 2 weeks worth of work there. You know, not full on 2 weeks, but it feels like it's been virtually 2 weeks non-stop for me building this thing. So a bit of a labour of love, I've got to say. And this, what I'm doing here, in case anybody's wondering, I'm covering up the sort of vanilla containers, because I don't think they look particularly good. So I'm using some of the containers from the workshop, just hiding the vanilla ones, and putting these down here in this kind of container yard, which is one of the main freight yards in the rail yard itself. Again, this helps to break up the monotony of the big areas of ground that you get, and just positioning these, because you've got a lot of these kind of container yards in these areas, and I think that really kind of makes everything come to life as soon as you start putting all these little details in. And this is going to be a big, you know, it's going to be this big kind of industrial city, Santa Capricia. So the rail yard has to fit the scale of what I'm intending the city to be like in terms of its industry. So guys, this is it. This is the end of this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. I shall be hopefully bringing a new one out, not as long, maybe in a week or so. I don't know what I'm going to be doing next, got to be honest, but do stick around for the cinematics, and bid you farewell and see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, and thanks and cheerio guys, see you next time. Ping out.